Hello everyone, today I want to talk about the world famous book Don Quixote, TLC, and chasing windmills. Hello everyone, as discussed in the intro, we're going to talk about a few subjects here, but primarily within the context Don Quixote, the incredible Spanish book, one of the first novels ever written. And I read this novel, and I've known about this novel for a little while. I've been thinking about how can I structure it into a video, and listening to one of my favourite bands of all time, TLC, and listening to the song Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls really reminded me of the power of the book Don Quixote. TLC, if you haven't heard it, jump on YouTube and check the video out. But Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls is basically the song of what's in front of you is so important, but we spend so much time chasing these waterfalls which never end up being what we expect them to be. And Don Quixote is the story of that, the constant not feeling good enough and constantly trying to do things about it and failing. So, as always, to begin, I have a quote on the subject, and that quote is, "All the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." Shakespeare. So all the world's a stage is a common English phrase that you'll hear, and it's just a great way that Shakespeare sort of just talked about the play, the beauty of just playing, just being, just acting on the earth and not worrying too much about what you're going to leave behind. So really this is illustrated best by the book Don Quixote. So Don Quixote is a Spanish novel which was published in two volumes in 1605 and 1615, and it's considered one of the most influential works of literature. In fact, it was considered one of the first novels ever written, fantasy novels, which is obviously a huge part of the world's fantasy reading, whether you look at Game of Thrones or you look at the books that are written. So basically it follows Alonso, who's about 50 years old, and all he does is read fantasy books about knights and chivalry and King Arthur and all that sort of gear. And it drives him crazy. He just sits there and goes, well, my life's no good. I'm reading all these books and all these amazing adventures. So he decides, he has a bit of a mental breakdown, decides to get on his horse and just become a knight. So he gets a suit of armour made and he just sort of cruises around. He even finds like a romantic fixation who doesn't even know he exists. He finds some girl that he has to be chivalrous and save around. And then he lives his medieval fantasy. So he heads out with his friend and they go to conquer monsters and fight battles. And unfortunately, it just ends in failure. And probably one of the most recognised parts of the book is that ultimately Don Quixote can't find any monsters. So when he goes to Holland and sees windmills, he starts charging the windmills and fighting them and telling everyone that they're monsters, and he defeated these great monsters. So you can see sort of breakdown that happens from the stress of not being enough. Finally, he fails. He knows that this didn't work. He renounces all his work, and around his death, he sort of realizes it was all a failure and then dies. So interesting story, very similar to the life of Ivan Ilyich, written by Dostoevsky. Which is another great book. So what does this book teach us? Why was Don Quixote? Why is it still being talked about 500 years later? Well, the key issues it deals with is over-intellectualizing. So Don Quixote spent so much time thinking and fantasizing and not living his own life, he ultimately started to feel there was something missing. And this is something that happens to over-intellectualizing. When we spend so much time reading about the place we want to visit that we get to the point where we become anxious about visiting it and maybe never visiting it. So over-intellectualizing is something that, once again, I'll draw on the classic Beautiful Day by U2. What you don't know, you can feel it somehow. Don't let your belief that you don't know enough about something stop you, because everything in your DNA is already here to prepare you for what's coming up. Second thing it teaches us is media expectations of fame. Don Quixote was struggling with something that we all struggle with right now, which is we're conditioned by society that if you're not Kanye, if you're not Kim, if you're not on the red carpet, then you must be of less value than those individuals. And it's a very cautionary tale about getting too involved in the media. Don Quixote got caught up in his media at the time, which was King Arthur and the Knights and all those sort of books. Became so engrossed he felt that he was worthless, and that's what's happening to our children, unfortunately, as we continually focus on these superficial parts of the world. People are feeling less than, and the media is really to blame for that. It was only no one that I know can name an actor more than 100 years that's been around for more than 100 years, because before that, actors weren't seen as people to look up to, musicians weren't seen people to look up to. It was generals and philosophers and great priests and great people and Jesus and the Buddha. And now we think, the Scarlett Johansson is we should be listening to her opinion, which maybe we should, but it's just interesting that we put those guys on such a pedestal before they've really added any value outside of the acting field. Taking information at face value is another thing that Don Quixote really illustrates, is that he looks at these books and thinks that this is absolutely achievable, and he doesn't think it through. He doesn't sit there and allow him to understand that this is simply a fantasy, and he takes the information at face value and he goes out and he does all those things and they don't work for him. And that's something that's really important to understand, is as the media feeds information to you, that information is corporate information. The news channel you're watching is a corporate entity, and that corporate entity owes its value to its shareholders and is simply a business. It's not there to give you excellent information. And knowing that's really important allows you not to reject the information, but to understand that it sits within the framework of truth. What else did we learn? So our mind's ability to really create and manufacture problems. So Don Quixote saw a windmill, turned it into a monster. And how often do we do that in life? Where we refuse to see things as they are, which is, not threatening, not a problem, not a big deal, but we make them up into monsters, into big issues, and then we go in and fight them, and they eventually become the monster, because there was so much effort, so much anger and hatred towards that issue that ultimately it consumes us. Second to last, what do we learn? The game of life will end and change will be constant. We all know Ivan Illich, the Dostoevsky book, where the last passage of the book was him having his last breath and looking at his wife and saying, what if it was all for nothing? And this is really Don Quixote's challenge, is that we're all going to get to a point in our life where it's about to end. And living these fantasies, taking information at face value, thinking that you're less than and trying to live other people's lives will leave you with a feeling of incompleteness, and there's nothing worse than on your deathbed. But because you're not in your deathbed right now, you can do something about it. And even if you're in your deathbed right now, you can still do something about it by being present in the eternal moment. And finally, ideas on the past and our lives. So really what we're looking at here is that Don Quixote was fixated on another era. He was looking at another time, and he tried to create his value system based on that period, and it failed miserably. And we see this quite often when people take the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, and even the sutras at face value without understanding the context they were written in. When Jesus would talk about salvation, liberation, the kingdom of God coming, a lot of that information was directed to people who really wanted to see the Roman occupation ended. So they emphasised that very, very highly, whereas perhaps his teachings on forgiveness and kindness were more important in today's context, where we're not so worried about being liberated by a big boss. So really what it talks about is that understanding that our lives don't need to be lived on what the past has written. Steve Jobs once said that living with other people's dogma is living through their beliefs, living their lives, and I really believe that. Don Quixote, an incredible book. I'm sure you've heard the words before, but the reason it's so important is because there's so many lessons for today about not buying into this mass media hysteria, not choosing your identity in life based on fictional characters, like the sports stars and celebrities of today. And it's something to really think about. If you have a chance to read it yourself, that's fantastic. The other book, Ivan Illich, I'd really recommend. Something to think about. I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.